It is now completely dark around you, with nothing but the sound of your own calm breathing. In this deep night, we are about to enter a strange and almost forgotten chapter of history. The subjects that people usually hesitated to talk about, or that were only whispered, today we will bring them into the light, though it will be a slow revelation, cloaked in sleep. Today's topic is the strangest methods of pregnancy testing in medieval history, and some even more bizarre stories. The Middle Ages, a time when women's lives were deeply entwined with the cycle of pregnancy and childbirth. Confirming pregnancy was extremely important from a social, hereditary, and spiritual perspective. But without modern contraception or blood tests, people of that era relied on methods that today seem incredible, strange, and sometimes comical. These tests were a complex mixture of science, superstition, and simple folk belief. Let us try to understand the psychology of the people of that time, who feared or were reassured by even the slightest symptoms. First, we will look at the method that was perhaps the most widely circulated, but had no scientific basis. This was the grain and water test. In many regions of medieval Europe, it was believed that if a woman wanted to confirm whether she was pregnant, she had to collect her urine in a vessel late at night. Then, specific types of grains, such as barley or wheat, were sprinkled on the urine. The test was performed in complete silence and darkness. If the woman was pregnant, these grains would swell within a certain period, or bubbles would appear on the water's surface due to some chemical reaction, or the grains would behave differently. If the grains remained unchanged, it was assumed she was not pregnant. This test persisted for centuries, and no chemical process worked behind it. Rather, its effectiveness depended entirely on environmental humidity, grain quality, and above all, the mental expectation of the woman undergoing the test. Imagine that moment, the woman sitting alone in the dead of night, her future depending on a few grains, her mental agitation, her hopes or fears. All of these would cast an invisible influence on the test results. It was not science, it was a silent ritual of waiting. Next, let's turn to another popular method, the torch and smoke test. This test was even more dramatic. A woman would be taken to an open space at night, where a small fire or torch was prepared. It was believed that if the woman was pregnant, the vapor or breath emanating from her body would have a special effect on the fire. For example, some would say that if the vapor went straight up, she was not pregnant. But if the vapor bent or the torch flame flickered unusually, it was a sign of pregnancy. This method was actually dependent on optical illusions and minor changes in the air. In the Middle Ages, even a slight gust of wind or a change in humidity could affect a flame strangely, and people would interpret minor signs as destiny. Your breathing is now slowing. The silence of the grains and the flickering light of the torch, these two images are calming all the agitation in your mind. We have just emerged from the mysterious world of grain and torch tests, where human expectation and superstition combined to produce strange results. Now we will enter a part of medieval testing methods that was even more symbolic, darker, and directly linked to human belief and physical reactions. These methods prevailed in society for many years because their underlying reasons were mysterious and not easily understood. Next, we will look at tests that relied on the body's own reactions, especially the test of the gold coin or metal. This test was prevalent among relatively wealthy or aristocratic women. It was believed that a specially prepared gold or copper coin would be taken to test for pregnancy. That coin would be submerged in urine collected in a specific vessel. Behind this process was a folk belief that if the woman was pregnant, the color of that metal would change. Either it would become dull, or a greenish or blackish layer would form on it. This change was seen as a reflection of mysterious forces within the body. In reality, there was no scientific basis behind this test either. Inert metals like gold typically do not undergo any visible chemical reaction with the normal components of urine. The success of this test depended mainly on two factors. First, the personal belief or expectation of the person performing the test, and second, the slight variation in the chemical composition of urine due to hormonal changes in women's bodies at that time, which was mistakenly interpreted as a change in the metal's color. Often, if the metal was made of copper, it could become slightly discolored due to the acidity of the urine, which was then taken as proof of the result. This test was a name for a long wait, where a desperate attempt was made to know the result even before physical symptoms appeared. This period of waiting was the most painful, where anxiety would continuously increase. Next, let's talk about another strange and somewhat unpleasant test, which was the use of salt and honey. Some ancient texts mention the preparation of a mixture to confirm pregnancy. Combining the bitterness of honey and the intensity of salt, a mixture was prepared and either administered orally or used near specific organs. It was believed that a pregnant woman's body would react differently to this mixture, such as immediate nausea or abdominal discomfort. If there was no reaction, it was assumed she was not pregnant. This test was also largely based on the belief in exaggerated physical reactions. Many women in the early stages of pregnancy naturally experience nausea, morning sickness, or aversion to food. When these normal physical symptoms were tested with an artificial stimulant, a mixture of salt and honey, some form of physical discomfort often occurred, which was taken as evidence of the result's veracity. In this process, believers unknowingly merely replicated the natural symptoms of pregnancy. Most of these tests were long, tedious, and required secrecy, which made it even more difficult for women in medieval society. Each test was actually an alternative to waiting for physical symptoms, which could somewhat alleviate their anxiety. And finally, in this section, we will look at reliance on animals. In medieval folklore, some animals were seen as a means of prophecy or truth revelation. A common test involved observing the droppings of a bird or the behavior of a specific animal. In some regions, it was believed that if a particular type of bird or mouse, after being kept in a specific environment, became sick or behaved unusually, it indicated the woman's pregnancy. This belief likely originated from ancient astrology and the concept of observing animal behavior, which took on a more distorted form in the Middle Ages. Even a slight discomfort in an animal was then considered the result of supernatural forces. All these tests, the dullness of gold, the taste of honey, or the behavior of a bird, each was simple, almost laughable, but in the context of that time, they were symbols of life and death, or honor and shame. These tests confirmed how long and how strange a path women had to travel to get confirmed news of pregnancy. This period of collecting and processing all this information slowly leads the listener into a deep rest. We have just emerged from the mysterious world of grain and torch tests, where human expectation and superstition combined to produce strange results. Now we will enter a part of medieval testing methods that was even more symbolic, darker, and directly linked to human belief and physical reactions. These methods prevailed in society for many years because their underlying reasons were mysterious and not easily understood. Next, we will look at tests that relied on the body's own reactions, especially the test of the gold coin or metal. This test was prevalent among relatively wealthy or aristocratic women. It was believed that a specially prepared gold or copper coin would be taken to test for pregnancy. That coin would be submerged in urine collected in a specific vessel. Behind this process was a folk belief that if the woman was pregnant, the color of that metal would change. Either it would become dull, or a greenish or blackish layer would form on it. This change was seen as a reflection of mysterious forces within the body. In reality, there was no scientific basis behind this test either. Inert metals, like gold, typically do not undergo any visible chemical reaction with the normal components of urine. The success of this test depended mainly on two factors. First, the personal belief or expectation of the person performing the test, and second, the slight variation in the chemical composition of urine due to hormonal changes in women's bodies at that time, which was mistakenly interpreted as a change in the metal's color. Often, if the metal was made of copper, it could become slightly discolored due to the acidity of the urine, which was then taken as proof of the result. This test was a name for a long wait, where a desperate attempt was made to know the result even before physical symptoms appeared. This period of waiting was the most painful, where anxiety would continuously increase. Next, let's talk about another strange and somewhat unpleasant test, which was the use of salt and honey. Some ancient texts mention the preparation of a mixture to confirm pregnancy. Combining the bitterness of honey and the intensity of salt, a mixture was prepared and either administered orally or used near specific organs. It was believed that a pregnant woman's body would react differently to this mixture, such as immediate nausea or abdominal discomfort. If there was no reaction, it was assumed she was not pregnant. This test was also largely based on the belief in exaggerated physical reactions. Many women in the early stages of pregnancy naturally experience nausea, morning sickness, or aversion to food. When these normal physical symptoms were tested with an artificial stimulant, a mixture of salt and honey, some form of physical discomfort often occurred, which was taken as evidence of the result's veracity. In this process, believers unknowingly merely replicated the natural symptoms of pregnancy. Most of these tests were long, tedious, and required secrecy, which made it even more difficult for women in medieval society. Each test was actually an alternative to waiting for physical symptoms, which could somewhat alleviate their anxiety. And finally, in this section, we will look at reliance on animals. In medieval folklore, some animals were seen as a means of prophecy or truth revelation. A common test involved observing the droppings of a bird or the behavior of a specific animal. In some regions, it was believed that if a particular type of bird or mouse, after being kept in a specific environment, became sick or behaved unusually, it indicated the woman's pregnancy. This belief likely originated from ancient astrology and the concept of observing animal behavior, which took on a more distorted form in the Middle Ages. Even a slight discomfort in an animal was then considered the result of supernatural forces. All these tests, the dullness of gold, the taste of honey, or the behavior of a bird, each was simple, almost laughable, but in the context of that time, they were symbols of life and death, or honor and shame. These tests confirmed how long and how strange a path women had to travel to get confirmed news of pregnancy. This period of collecting and processing all this information slowly leads the listener into a deep rest. We are slowly progressing through the strange methods of pregnancy testing for medieval women. After observing tests based on grains, metals, and animal behavior, we will now focus on those tests that were more physical, personal, and directly dependent on herbal or chemical ingredients. The third category of tests primarily relied on applying various herbs, beverages, or chemical mixtures to the body and observing its reactions. These methods were often performed secretly and under the supervision of experienced midwives or folk healers, as these processes were risky to reveal publicly. First, let's discuss the test of aloe and resin mixture. Numerous ancient texts and medieval folk medicine records mention the preparation of a special kind of drink to confirm pregnancy. The main ingredient of this mixture was aloe, known for its intense bitterness, and various types of resin or tree gum were added to thicken the mixture. This mixture was given to drink in very small quantities. The prevailing belief was that if a woman was pregnant, her body would reject this intense mixture, resulting in her vomiting intensely, immediately, or within a short time. If she showed no severe reaction after drinking, it was assumed that her body was undergoing some other chemical process associated with pregnancy. The logic behind this test was likely the sensitivity of pregnant women to nausea or morning sickness. Pregnant women are often overly sensitive to smells or tastes. This intense, bitter mixture could induce nausea in any woman's body, but this reaction was taken as specific proof of pregnancy. This test was a type of trial and error method, where whatever the outcome, it was interpreted as being associated with pregnancy in some way. The taste of the aloe and resin mixture was extremely unpleasant, so women had to endure much mental distress to complete the test. The next test was even more direct and somewhat aggressive, the vinegar and honey test. In this method, strong vinegar and honey were mixed in a specific proportion. After drinking this mixture, the woman had to wait for a certain period. It was believed that if she was pregnant, a special kind of sweet or sour smell, different from normal breath, would emanate from her breath. To examine this smell, a midwife or an experienced woman would come very close to her face and declare the result by smelling her breath. Due to the intense smell of vinegar and the sweetness of honey, this test was extremely uncomfortable. Hormonal changes during pregnancy can cause a slight alteration in breath odor, which is now known in medical science. But in the Middle Ages, this slight variation was taken as the basis for such strange tests. This method was very personal and demanded secrecy, as it required the physical proximity and the tension of another person. This process was a kind of ordeal for those women, where they were fighting not just for their physical condition, but also for their privacy and social standing. Alongside this, another method was prevalent, which was even more symbolic: the fruit rot test. In this method, an apple or another fruit was soaked in the woman's urine for a specific period. If the fruit began to rot faster than usual, it was considered a sign of pregnancy. This rotting process likely occurred due to the reaction of the fruit's components with ammonia or other components present in the urine, although there was no specific scientific proof for it. It was an attempt to reveal the truth through nature. All these tests created a strange kind of excitement and uncertainty in the lives of medieval women. Waiting for each new test, deep anxiety for each result, these feelings were part of the mystery surrounding their lives. These long and uncertain processes slowly lead the listener towards a deep, steady, and boring comfort, sleep, and deeper relaxation. We continue our discussion of the strange methods of pregnancy testing for medieval women. We have seen how results were determined based on grains, metals, and the symbolic power of nature. Now we will discuss those tests that were more symbolic and sometimes directly dependent on divine intervention, reflecting the simple yet profound religious beliefs of that era. Each step of these tests was long and full of anticipation, perfectly suited to lead the listener deeper. The fourth category of tests primarily relied on finding celestial or divine signs. In these tests, more importance was given to the satisfaction of the gods or some divine indication than to physical examination. Among these, a notable method is the analysis of torch and smoke forms, which we briefly mentioned before, but will now delve deeper into. In this test, the woman would be taken to a quiet place in the dead of night, where only the light of a single torch burned. Experienced midwives or priests believed that if the woman was pregnant, the warm vapor or breath emanating from her body would affect the torch flame in a specific way. It was believed that in normal conditions, the flame would rise in a straight line, but in the presence of pregnancy, the flame would slightly lean to the right or left, or it would unusually take on a blue or green hue, which was considered a sign of divine connection. This test would take a long time to complete, as the movement of the smoke depended on the slightest change in air or the inherent instability of the flame. During the test, the woman had to stand perfectly still and control her breathing, which would naturally become somewhat difficult due to pregnancy. Through this, any physical discomfort or slight error was linked to the result. When the flame slightly bent, it was considered a form of divine approval, and the mental relief or excitement of that moment further strengthened this belief. This entire process was one of long waiting, where there was nothing but silence and the torchlight. Next was another symbolic test, directly reliant on dreams or daydreams. According to this method, if a woman was deeply anxious about the possibility of pregnancy, she would have to drink specific herbs at night before going to sleep. It was believed that if she were pregnant, a specific object or scene would appear in her dreams, such as a ripe fruit, a small baby's hand, or a particular type of bird. The interpretation of these dream symbols was complex and often dependent on the tester's personal interpretation. To have these dreams, women often had to sleep in a windowless room where only a faint smoke of a specific herb gently entered. Due to the mild sedative effects of these herbs, women would often fall into deep and strange dreams. When they woke up, even the slightest element of their dreams was considered an indication of the result. Taking advantage of this mental state, midwives often gave interpretations according to their preferences, which created social pressure on women of that time. This dream analysis process was extremely time-consuming, as one had to wait a long time for a deep, meaningful dream to appear. And finally, we will look at the test that was the least common but most mysterious: the urine and light reaction test. Though sparsely documented, some specific religious groups believed that if a pregnant woman's urine was placed in a special type of crystal vessel and kept under the light of a full moon for some time, there would be a change in the color or density of the urine. In some cases, if it was exposed to sunlight, it would glow with a blue or green hue. This test was, of course, performed at night or in very dim light. During this process, it was essential to keep the vessel still and remove all artificial light from the environment, making the entire procedure extremely slow and prolonged. Even a tiny dust particle or a slight change in light could significantly affect the outcome. It was an attempt to find the subtlest changes in nature as proof of pregnancy. The long stages of all these tests and the long waiting period to know the results slowly lead the listener deeper into a calmer state. We are deeply engaged in the discussion of the depth and symbolic meaning of medieval pregnancy testing methods. After relying on grains, metals, herbs, and even dreams, we will now enter a stage where testing methods were based more directly on physical symptoms, but their interpretation was entirely driven by superstition and supernatural beliefs. These tests were relatively less experimental and more observational, forcing women to monitor their bodies for long periods. The sixth category of tests was observation of body heat and cold. A fundamental belief in medieval medical science was that the human body depended on the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Pregnancy was generally seen as an increase in warmth and humidity within the body. Therefore, a common way to test was to observe the warmth of the patient's hands, feet, or abdomen by touch. It was believed that if the woman was pregnant, the center of her body, especially the lower abdomen, would be unusually warm compared to other parts, as if a new life within was generating heat. To complete this test, midwives would keep their hands on the patient's body for a long time, trying to feel the difference in warmth. This process was slow, as this variation in warmth was extremely subtle and could easily depend on ambient temperature or the patient's mental state. If the abdomen felt unusually warm, it was considered a definite sign. Conversely, if a woman felt excessively cold, she was assumed to have cold or dry humors, indicating the absence of pregnancy. Such tests were not just a matter of minutes. They required prolonged, silent observation, repeated touching by hand, and waiting for some time for the result. These moments of waiting were the core components of a boring history. This time of touch and observation was both uncomfortable and hopeful for women. Next, we will look at the method that was relatively less physical but relied on prolonged observation. Observation of abnormality of the menstrual cycle. Although this is a normal symptom of pregnancy rather than a testing method, in the Middle Ages, this very normalcy was seen as a kind of test result. If a woman's menstrual cycle suddenly became irregular or stopped completely, it was considered the strongest evidence of pregnancy. But to confirm this cessation, one had to wait many months. Even after menstruation stopped, women often experienced irregular periods due to mental stress or illness, leading to false positive results. This waiting period was the longest and most agonizing. Midwives would instruct women that if there was no change even after a specific number of days had passed since their period stopped, only then should they assume pregnancy. These long months were full of uncertainty and hope. Even the slightest change in the menstrual cycle would become big news for society, as inheritance, property rights, and social status depended on this information. The silence of this long wait and the anticipation of physical changes were the longest and most tedious parts of medieval pregnancy testing. And finally, in this section, we will look at drinking a decoction of specific herbs. A warm decoction mixed with certain herbs, such as mint or lavender, was given to drink. It was believed that due to a pregnant woman's different digestive process, she would quickly digest this decoction or would not experience any particular physical discomfort, whereas a non-pregnant woman would vomit quickly. After drinking this decoction, the woman had to sit still for a long time so that the herb's effect could fully work on her. This process was a kind of slow chemical test that yielded results only through waiting. Every swallow, every moment of silent anticipation, all of this was an integral part of the lives of women of that time, bringing them physical and mental stillness. We are deeply immersed in the discussion of the depth and symbolic meaning of medieval pregnancy testing methods. After reliance on grains, metals, herbs, and even dreams, we will now enter a stage where testing methods were based more directly on physical symptoms, but their interpretation was entirely driven by superstition and supernatural beliefs. These tests were relatively less experimental and more observational, forcing women to monitor their bodies for long periods. The seventh category of tests was the test involving mirrors or shiny objects. This strange test was mainly prevalent in medieval rural areas, where simple glass or polished metal pieces were seen as tools for prophecy. The method was as follows. A virgin woman would be taken to a quiet, dark room, where a clean, polished metal vessel or sometimes a small mirror was placed. She would be instructed to urinate very carefully onto the vessel, and then cast moonlight or candlelight onto it. It was believed that if the woman was pregnant, a special kind of vague reflection would form on the light reflected in the vessel or on the liquid within the vessel, indicating pregnancy. This reflection was sometimes believed to appear as a miniature baby's figure, or sometimes as a religious symbol. For this test to be successful, environmental stability was crucial. Room temperature, the cleanliness of the vessel, and even the mental stability of the tester, everything affected the outcome. This test would take a long time to complete, as light had to be steadily cast onto the vessel, and deep concentration had to be maintained for a long time to notice that change. In this process, the slightest movement of light and liquid was interpreted as a supernatural sign. Such tests created deep anticipation in women's minds and an intense longing for even the slightest miraculous sign, which robbed them of their peace of mind. These long moments of observation and waiting were the most boring and tiring parts of this test. Next, we will look at another symbolic test, directly dependent on time, waiting between sunset and sunrise. In this method, a woman would have to collect urine on a specific day, such as a full moon or a particular religious day, after the appearance of the initial symptoms of pregnancy. The collected urine vessel would be left outdoors under the open sky from sunset until sunrise. It was believed that if the woman was pregnant, a special kind of crystals or marks would form in the first light of dawn on that liquid, or in the soil around the vessel, which would not be like ordinary dew. In some cases, it was believed that a special plant or algae would grow on the edge of the vessel or in the soil. This test required waiting one night and one morning to complete. Not seeing any results for this long period, no change, or overthinking about slight changes, women would become exhausted by this mental conflict. The excitement of seeing the results after dawn, and then the feeling of disappointment if no signs were found, this entire cycle was very long and mentally exhausting. Through these tests, we understand that confirming pregnancy in the Middle Ages was not a quick process. It was a complex cycle of long waits, physical discomfort, and supernatural interpretations. The silence of each step, the weight of every moment, is making your mind calmer, heavier, pushing you towards deep rest. We are entering deeper and deeper into the discussion of medieval pregnancy testing methods. In previous tests, we observed reliance on symbols, metals, and nature. Now, we will discuss those tests that were directly related to women's personal body parts and their daily lives, and which were the most personal, confidential, and dependent on physical processes. The long time and secrecy required to complete these tests were their most tedious aspects. The eighth category of tests was the test with special flour and urine. This was one of the most common and widely publicized tests which survived in various forms for centuries. The method was very simple, but its process was long. The woman had to collect her first morning urine and place it in a clean earthen pot. Then, a specific amount of very finely ground flour or ash was sprinkled over that urine. It was believed that if the woman was pregnant, the secret ingredients within the urine would react with the flour and create small bubbles on the flour, or the texture of the flour would unusually swell or change color. If there was no reaction, she was not pregnant. The most boring aspect of this test was the waiting time required for it. Typically, this mixture had to be kept in a quiet, warm place for several hours or sometimes for the entire night to allow sufficient time for the chemical reaction. During this long waiting period, the woman had to remain completely still so that the mixture in the pot would not be disturbed and give a false signal. This long, static, and often fruitless waiting period was the cause of mental fatigue. Every bubble or slight change was attempted to be verified without a microscope, and the interpretation of the results was often a reflection of personal desire. It was a kind of self-deception process where the intense desire to know the outcome compelled people to pay excessive attention to even the slightest change. Next, we will discuss the test that was extremely personal and based on late-appearing signs of pregnancy, palpation of specific body areas. This test was usually performed by experienced midwives when a woman's menstrual cycle had been absent for a long time. It was a kind of slow physical examination. The midwife would gently press on the patient's lower abdomen at specific intervals, sometimes over several weeks. They would look for any unusual tenderness in the lower abdomen or a slight lump that was not there before. In the early stages of pregnancy, the inner part of the lower abdomen gradually begins to firm up or change, which could be detected by experienced hands. But this test was the longest, because in the first few months of pregnancy, the changes were so subtle that multiple examinations with breaks were needed to confirm. Each time of touch, the woman had to be completely relaxed, and a long silence had to be maintained before declaring the result. These slow, repetitive touches and moments of waiting for the result were a kind of static, prolonged mental stress. And finally, in this section, we will look at the hair test with water or liquid. In some regions, it was believed that a woman's hair reflected her internal state. A long strand of hair would be cut and immersed in clean water or an experimental liquid. If the woman was pregnant, the hair would either remain straight or slowly curl. If the hair quickly coiled up or broke, it indicated the absence of pregnancy. This test was highly symbolic. Hair was seen as a symbol of life stability or bondage. This test also took a long time to complete, as one had to stare steadily for a long time to observe the slightest change in the hair. All these tests, due to their long waits and association with physical or mental distress, created a static, uninterrupted anxiety in the lives of medieval women which is difficult to imagine in today's fast-paced life. These long processes are taking you deeper into more peace. We are delving deeper and deeper into the discussion of medieval pregnancy testing methods. In previous discussions, we observed the slow processes relying on herbs, symbols, and physical observations. Now, we will approach some strange and almost religious rituals that were dependent on social and spiritual purity, and whose testing process was extremely long and mentally stressful. The ninth category of tests was the test of sacred particles or dust. Religious beliefs were deeply ingrained in medieval society. It was believed that if life came into a woman's womb as a blessing from God, that life would carry a kind of purity. This test was usually performed only when other natural or physical tests failed. The method was as follows. The woman would be taken to a sacred place, such as near a local church or monastery, where dust from the remains of a saint or hermit, relics dust, was kept. The tester would take a small amount of that sacred dust in a vessel and mix it with the woman's urine. If the woman was pregnant, the sacred dust would dissolve differently than usual, or settle at the bottom of the vessel in the mixture, providing evidence of divine intervention. This test was extremely long because it required a special day or the presence of a specific saint. Not only that, but one had to pray silently for a long time in the sacred place so that the environment remained pure during the test. The belief that these dust particles would behave differently than ordinary dust was purely a reliance on the miraculous. Changes in this mixture were observed for many hours, where even the slightest alteration would give the final declaration of the result. This entire process was ceremonial, performed with respect, and at the same time an extreme test of mental patience for women, because failure meant social reproach or a long wait. Next, we will look at the method that was a faint echo of ancient Roman or Greek traditions, the geometric test of light and shadow. Although less common, this test was prevalent among the elite or learned circles. At a specific time, usually midday when the sun was directly overhead, the woman would be placed in a room where light entered through only one small opening. That beam of light would create a specific geometric shape on the floor or wall. It was believed that if a pregnant woman's urine or bodily gaseous emission fell on that beam of light, the shape of the light would slightly change. Either it would expand or its edges would become blurry. This test required stability of light and the correct amount of dust in the room to be completed. This observation, lasting a few minutes, demanded extreme concentration, as the slightest movement could change the shape of the light. Although this test was done in the middle of the day, its silence and the need for subtle observation made it long and tedious. During this process, the woman also had to control her breathing so that the slightest movement of her body would not affect the test. And finally, in this section, we will look at a simple observation from medieval agrarian society, the seed sowing test. In some rural areas, it was believed that if a fruit or seed was somehow affected by a woman's pregnancy, it would germinate differently. This test was the most long-term. Specific types of seeds, such as peas or beans, were soaked in urine and then sown in a specific earthen pot. If the woman was pregnant, the seeds would germinate faster than usual or take on a different shape in the germination process. Consequently, the small seedling had to be monitored for the next few weeks. Watering a small amount daily and waiting for each new sprout was a long, dull, and waiting process. This long period of observation was the main reason for making this test boring, as it would take weeks to get results. All these methods, due to their formality, waiting, and uncertainty, brought a kind of prolonged stillness into the lives of medieval women. Each step of this process is drawing you deeper into more peace. We have entered the final observation stage of medieval women's pregnancy testing processes. Whether the test succeeded or failed, the social reaction and long-term observation process after the result declaration was often longer and more tedious than the original test itself. These observations solidified superstitions deep within society. The 11th category of observation was guessing the child's gender and its social impact before birth. In medieval society, knowing the gender of a child was as important as confirming pregnancy. If a couple expected a son for their first child to secure inheritance, then even after pregnancy was confirmed, the gender testing phase would be added to the testing procedure. A common method was to guess the gender based on the color or smell of the urine. If the urine was very dark yellow or had a strong ammonia-like smell, it was said to be an indication of a male child, as the birth of a son was associated with warm and dry natures. If the urine was light, sweet-smelling, or colorless, it predicted a female child, which was associated with cold and humid natures. This guessing process would last for several months. Women were told to observe the change in their urine according to different months of pregnancy and adjust their diet accordingly. There was no scientific basis for these observations, but under the pressure of social expectations, women would spend hours observing changes in their urine color. With each change in color, their anxiety or joy would increase, keeping their mental state unstable for a longer period. This gender guessing phase would continue almost until the last month of pregnancy, creating a long wait even after confirmed pregnancy. Next, we will look at a strange social custom, which was the prolonged ritual of purification. After pregnancy was confirmed, especially if it occurred in an aristocratic family, the woman had to go through a long purification process to prove herself pure in the eyes of society. As part of this process, the woman had to consume certain foods, such as only wet bread or water, for a specified period, and wear specific clothes, which would demonstrate her purity in the eyes of society. This purification period often lasted for several weeks or months, disrupting the woman's normal eating habits and leading to physical weakness. During this time, they had to remain strictly indoors and were not allowed to participate in any social events. This prolonged isolation and control over food was a form of punishment and at the same time a confirmation process. Many would see their physical weakness as a side effect of pregnancy, which made the whole process even slower and more boring. And finally, we will look at the issue that remains mysterious even in modern times, the false hope of post-conception menstruation. In the Middle Ages, some women would experience slight bleeding or spotting in the early stages of pregnancy, which they mistakenly took for the last phase of menstruation. This bleeding was then interpreted as release of blood, or the last sign caused by conception. Women who were pregnant for the first time would see this slight bleeding and think that the test was wrong and that they had returned to their menstrual cycle. Due to this false hope, they would start living a normal life again, but after some time, when menstruation stopped, they would start the tests again from the beginning. This cycle of misinformation and retesting could continue for months, leading to a kind of prolonged mental uncertainty. It was a kind of repetitive cycle where the whirlpool of hope and disappointment continued. These long, static observations, the pressure of social expectations, and the focus on unnatural rules were an integral part of medieval life. These silent, slow descriptions are now helping you sink deeper into more peace. We have entered the final observation stage of medieval women's pregnancy testing processes. Whether the test succeeded or failed, the social reaction and long-term observation process after the result declaration was often longer and more tedious than the original test itself. These observations solidified superstitions deep within society. The 11th category of observation was guessing the child's gender and its social impact before birth. In medieval society, knowing the gender of a child was as important as confirming pregnancy. If a couple expected a son for their first child to secure inheritance, then even after pregnancy was confirmed, the gender testing phase would be added to the testing procedure. A common method was to guess the gender based on the color or smell of the urine. If the urine was very dark yellow or had a strong ammonia-like smell, it was said to be an indication of a male child, as the birth of a son was associated with warm and dry natures. If the urine was light, sweet-smelling, or colorless, it predicted a female child, which was associated with cold and humid natures. This guessing process would last for several months. Women were told to observe the change in the color of their urine according to different months of pregnancy, and adjust their diet accordingly. There was no scientific basis for these observations, but under the pressure of social expectations, women would spend hours observing changes in their urine color. With each change in color, their anxiety or joy would increase, keeping their mental state unstable for a longer period. This gender guessing phase would continue almost until the last month of pregnancy, creating a long wait even after confirmed pregnancy. Next, we will look at a strange social custom, which was the prolonged ritual of purification. After pregnancy was confirmed, especially if it occurred in an aristocratic family, the woman had to go through a long purification process to prove herself pure in the eyes of society. As part of this process, the woman had to consume certain foods, such as only wet bread or water, for a specified period, and wear specific clothes which would demonstrate her purity in the eyes of society. This purification period often lasted for several weeks or months, disrupting the woman's normal eating habits and leading to physical weakness. During this time, they had to remain strictly indoors and were not allowed to participate in any social events. This prolonged isolation and control over food was a form of punishment and, at the same time, a confirmation process. Many would see their physical weakness as a side effect of pregnancy, which made the whole process even slower and more boring. And finally, we will look at the issue that remains mysterious even in modern times, the false hope of post-conception menstruation. In the Middle Ages, some women would experience slight bleeding or spotting in the early stages of pregnancy, which they mistakenly took for the last phase of menstruation. This bleeding was then interpreted as release of blood or the last sign caused by conception. Women who were pregnant for the first time would see this slight bleeding and think that the test was wrong and that they had returned to their menstrual cycle. Due to this false hope, they would start living a normal life again, but after some time, when menstruation stopped, they would start the tests again from the beginning. This cycle of misinformation and retesting could continue for months, leading to a kind of prolonged mental uncertainty. It was a kind of repetitive cycle where the whirlpool of hope and disappointment continued. These long, static observations, the pressure of social expectations, and the focus on unnatural rules were an integral part of medieval life. These silent, slow descriptions are now helping you sink deeper into more peace.
We have traversed the methods of medieval pregnancy testing and the subsequent long phases of observation. Now, we will enter the part that was connected to this entire process, but was not directly linked to testing or physical signs. That is, postnatal observation and folkloric influence. The current objective is to discuss the lengthy process of how folk beliefs and social expectations continued to influence a family even in the years following the confirmation of pregnancy. The discussion in Chapter 13 is the extended process of child naming and dedication. In the Middle Ages, the birth of a child was not just a physical event, it was a social and spiritual one, with naming being a crucial and lengthy process. Immediately after birth, the child was not quickly given a name, especially if it was the first child in an aristocratic family. Before name selection, the infant was kept under observation for a period. It was believed that only if the child remained healthy for some time after birth without sickness or weakness and showed no unusual signs would they be considered pure and given a name. This observation period often lasted for weeks or even months, during which the child's reaction to the influence of various auspicious objects was tested. During this time, the infant was placed near certain symbolic objects, such as a piece of a saint's garment, a drop of holy water, or a garland of specific herbs. If the child remained calm and healthy in the presence of these objects, it was assumed their future was auspicious. This entire process was extremely prolonged, as deep concentration and silence were required at every step. Each night, the child's breathing, sleep, and the slightest sound of crying were carefully analyzed. This long, steady observation and the debate among family members over selecting an auspicious name for the child continued for months, creating a kind of chronic psychological stress. This waiting period was the core of the boring history, where even the most crucial event in life took a long time to be confirmed. Next, we will look at social pressure for succession and its long-term effect. Especially in families where a male heir was expected, the real work seemed to begin after the pregnancy was confirmed. If the first child was a daughter, efforts to conceive again began within the next few months. This relentless cycle of attempts was long and exhausting. The psychological pressure was on the men to ensure the continuation of their lineage. This pressure was reflected even more intensely on the women, as their bodies had to be constantly ready for conception. This cycle continued for years, featuring recurring phases of pregnancy testing, confirmation, and anticipation regarding the child's gender. Each failure, or the birth of a daughter, created the necessity to begin a new test, a process that could span years. This continuous pressure and physical exertion led to a form of mental stagnation, which over time generated only a sense of waiting and repetition. And finally, in this section, we will discuss folk beliefs of death and rebirth in pregnancy. In the Middle Ages, pregnancy and childbirth were viewed as a symbolic transition from one extreme of life to another, from death to birth. Often, after conception was confirmed, women believed their old self was dying and they were entering a new life. Consequently, they would often abandon their familiar possessions for long periods or isolate themselves in specific locations, a process that symbolized death and purification. This isolation and distance from the familiar environment amounted to voluntary solitude, which physically and mentally created monotony over a long time. The entire period was one of deep, still, and quiet waiting, where the concept of time seemed to have paused. This long phase of waiting, the burden of social expectations, and the results of strange tests help you sink deeper into more tranquility. All anxiety is now fading away. We have concluded the discussion on medieval pregnancy testing methods and are now moving toward the subject that arose within society based on the results of these tests, namely, secret abortions, folklore of illicit conception, and its legal ramifications. These matters were extremely confidential, which is why the folklore built upon them requires a more extensive and prolonged analysis. The discussion in Chapter 14 is Secret Abortions and Herbal Remedies. In medieval society, illicit or unwanted pregnancy was a terrible social stigma, especially if it involved the upper echelons of society or was connected with religious doctrines. When a test yielded a negative result but menstruation did not return, or when a pregnancy had to be terminated for any reason even after a positive test, attempts at secret abortion were made. This process was extremely perilous and relied on certain herbs that were highly toxic and whose correct dosage was unknown. Among these herbs, the most prominent were savine, juniper berries, or root of rue. These herbs were extremely potent and capable of inducing abortion even when consumed in small quantities. The problem, however, was the unknown precise dosage. Consuming slightly more could endanger the mother's life. Midwives or local healers prepared these mixtures very carefully, but the results were often uncertain. The test was not a single-day event. It involved weeks of preparing the herbal mixture, consuming it at specific times, and observing the body's reaction. The long process of meticulously measuring the ingredients before preparing the mixture each day, followed by a prolonged struggle with abdominal pain after drinking the concoction, all of this constituted a tiresome, slow-paced mental and physical struggle. These secret attempts often failed, but the process would continue until a severe illness or death occurred. Next, we will examine the long narrative of illicit pregnancy and social purge. If a pregnancy was deemed illicit in the eyes of society, such as in the case of an unmarried woman, the societal reaction was prolonged and the punishment was severe. Not only the woman, but also her family would face the threat of social boycott. To remove this stigma, the family had to undergo a long period of penance.
This often included a formal process where the woman had to publicly apologize and accept a form of social isolation for a specific period. During this period of isolation, she was often subjected to hard labor or fasting as punishment. Her life during this time was monotonous and aimless, merely waiting for the completion of her purification in the eyes of society. This social isolation and prolonged punitive process was a form of social incarceration that could last for years, demonstrating that the process of punishment was not instantaneous, but enduring. And finally, in this section, we will look at long testimony and evidence seeking in court. If an illicit pregnancy or an attempted abortion came to light and faced legal action, the court process was exceedingly lengthy. Witnesses were summoned who had to describe the testing procedure, who said what and when, which herbs were used, and so on. These testimony processes continued for days, with every minor piece of information being scrutinized. The recording of each witness's statement, verification of its truthfulness, and the long arguments of lawyers, all of this contributed to a waste of time and mental exhaustion. The protracted nature of this legal process brought a kind of stillness to the lives of the people of that era, where everything moved exceedingly slowly. The discussion of all these secret attempts, long waits, and social reactions helps you sink deeper into more tranquility. All restlessness is now subdued. We have nearly concluded the discussion on medieval pregnancy testing methods and their social consequences. Now we enter the section where the connection between folklore and reality becomes more subtle, namely postnatal folklore and naming rituals, which represented a new phase of prolonged and steady observation. The discussion in Chapter 15 is the infant's first cry and its significance. In the Middle Ages, the sound of the infant's first cry after delivery was regarded with immense importance. It was believed that this initial sound would determine the child's future destiny and the strength of its bond with the family. If the cry was strong, deep, and steady, the child was thought to be long-lived and to have a bright future. However, if the cry was weak, faint, or in an unusual tone, it was seen as a sign of impending misfortune or spiritual weakness. Following the first cry, the midwife and family members spent a long time analyzing the sound. They assessed the cry's intensity, duration, and whether there was any abnormality within it. Although this observation was immediate, the subsequent weeks of infant care and the specific rituals prescribed for the child were altered based on this analysis. If the cry was perceived as weak, the child would be given a decoction of special herbs to drink or wrapped in warm blankets for an extended period. This entire process was slow and meticulous, with every moment of sound and silence being observed. This prolonged waiting and caution stemming from the first sound subsequently gave rise to various rituals imposed on the child. Next is the extended preparation for the christening ceremony. The naming or christening ceremony was a crucial social event, but the preparation for it lasted for a long time. After the child's birth and the initial weeks of observation had passed, the time for name selection arrived. The naming process was lengthy because the name was not just the child's identity. It determined the child's future fortune and protection. Families sought names associated with saints or holy figures, which would protect the child from evil forces. Prolonged discussions took place among family elders to select an appropriate name. Sometimes multiple potential names were debated, with the argument over which would be the most auspicious taking a considerable amount of time. This discussion, the search for symbolic meaning, and the eventual finalization of a name would take weeks, keeping the family in a prolonged state of anticipation. This extended preparatory phase was essentially a social process that declared the end of all the tests. And finally, in this section, we will look at the first garment and its purification rituals. The first garment made for the infant was considered highly sacred. The process of making this garment often began in the later months of the mother's pregnancy and also took a long time to complete. It was believed that this garment must be purified through a special process, such as placing it in the smoke of specific herbs or washing it in holy water and then drying it for an extended period. This purification process was extremely slow, as it was essential to ensure that the garment was not contaminated in any way. The drying period was long, especially in humid weather, and the garment had to be carefully guarded during this time. This period of waiting brought a kind of stillness, where everyone prepared for the child's arrival, but there was no rush. Caught in the vortex of all these prolonged observations, symbolic rituals, and social discussions, medieval life was steady and boring. Every moment was controlled, and every decision required a long wait. This silence and stillness is helping you sink deeper into more tranquility. We are concluding the description of those peculiar medieval tests where the arrival or absence of pregnancy was determined not by science, but by belief, symbolism, and prolonged waiting. This discussion will now turn towards a silent synthesis and stillness. In this final phase, we will present the summary of the entire process in the form of a list of steady observations. This list will not provide any new information, but will rather reiterate the prolonged processes discussed previously, which will help the mind settle peacefully without any new stimuli. First part of the summary: the stillness of results and waiting. Imagine that after every test there was a long wait. After conducting the urine test, one had to wait for hours to know the result. During this waiting period, the woman had to sit motionless, simply gazing at the vessel, without any movement or talk. This silence was a form of meditation, where the concept of time seemed to pause. This stillness was enduring, where no external stimulation was permitted. If the test came back negative, preparation had to start anew for the following month, meaning the cycle of waiting resumed, but this time with more experience and greater caution. This repetition was the core mantra of boring history. Second part: social expectation and prolonged silence. Even after pregnancy was confirmed, it was not announced to society. Secrecy was maintained until the physical changes became evident. This prolonged duration, lasting for several months, created a kind of latent tension and steady silence within the family. If an outsider posed a question, they were evaded or given a false answer. In this era of secrecy, every rumor, every whisper was a topic of discussion.
But the final announcement came very slowly, which again brought a new kind of stillness, no longer of uncertainty, but the stillness of the impending responsibility. This period of prolonged silence was an integral part of medieval life. Third part, final reflection and call to rest. We have learned about the testing methods witnessed by medieval women, their waiting, and the social pressure imposed upon them. Even in the most difficult circumstances, they chose a long, slow, and often miraculous path to ensure the continuity of life. That stillness of the time, those long, boring, and cautious moments are now surrounding you. All the restlessness, all the superstitions of the past are now gone. Your body is heavy, your mind is calm. This lengthy account of history is leading you toward ultimate rest. There are no more tests, no more waiting, only deep, continuous silence and comfort. At this moment, only tranquility prevails around you. No sound, no movement, no thought, only stillness and rest. We will look at the failure of tests and the cycle's repetition. In the Middle Ages, the failure of pregnancy tests was a very common occurrence. When a woman did not receive a result after performing multiple tests, frustration would descend upon society and the family. But this frustration never led to a quick resolution. Instead, the same procedures would be repeated after a failure, but this time with greater caution and fear. The woman might be instructed to wait a little longer, or to visit another midwife who followed different regional folk beliefs. Consequently, the same types of tests, such as the grain or urine tests, would be repeated at different times in different environments. This cycle of repetition was extremely prolonged, as each new test required the silence of urine collection, the slow process of preparing ingredients, and hours of sitting still. The continuation of this cycle of failure created chronic mental fatigue, which was an inherent part of boring history, because the reality of that time was never reaching a final conclusion. Next, we will discuss the prolonged preservation of traditional knowledge. In the Middle Ages, testing methods were generally not in written form, but were memorized and passed down through generations among midwives or healers. The process of preserving this knowledge was exceedingly slow. There was no opportunity to question the efficacy of a testing method simply because it was established practice. Thus, instead of adopting any new methods, the old, obsolete, and tiresome methods were practiced repeatedly. Long discussions, symbolic interpretations, and unnecessary complications were added to preserve this knowledge, which further extended the duration of each procedure. This prolonged practice of traditional knowledge created a kind of cultural stillness, where the rapid entry of any new scientific idea was impossible. This repetition and practice of ancient knowledge was the stability of that era. And finally, to bring this long discussion to a close, we will focus on the call for stillness and deep rest. We have walked through all those tests, all that waiting, fear, hope, and prolonged observation of the Middle Ages. Now all that restlessness is over. With the same slow pace at which we entered the depth of this history, we will now return towards complete rest. Your eyes are now closed, your body is heavy and comfortable. All medieval anxieties, all the uncertainties of pregnancy, everything is now a distant story of the past. Your mind is now completely calm, no tests remain, no waiting.
Only deep, continuous, and comfortable silence prevails. This silence is taking you deeper, to a place where there is no sound, no thought, only still and rest. Hello, viewers who have been with me until now. I hope you will all subscribe to the channel.